This sad story is a perfect example of why integrity and honesty are crucial in our personal relationships, and how dishonesty can often lead to unintended consequences.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I don't think I've heard anyone describe Kaitlin Armstrong as a heartless psychopath. That's largely because emotions are the reason this crime was committed, not a lack of emotion. You may think this is a very obvious point, and it is, but the same obvious point counts in many other cases as well. The crime is committed not because someone is an emotionless monster, but the opposite, because they are overwhelmed by their emotions. Think of that statement in the context of so many cases: Chris Watts, Scott Peterson, the murder of Suzanne Morphew, Laurie Vallow, Letitia Stalk, and on and on and on. It's an important statement to make because true crime blowhards are always referring to perpetrators as psychopaths, and they very seldom are. I have my doubts the Long Island serial killer is one, or the suspect in the Idaho student murders. This is because the emotional narrative is one of the most misunderstood and unacknowledged areas in true crime. We seem to be in denial about the emotional range of criminals, perhaps because we're in denial about some area regarding our own emotions. It's critical that you understand this area because emotions, if they are allowed to take over, can become a fire-breathing dragon that can burn one's entire world to ash, just as it did in Caitlin's story. Coming back to this case, the defense cleverly, and I would say slyly, tried to portray Caitlyn as someone very much in control of her emotions. Meek, passive, a shrinking violet, essentially. Do you think that's who Caitlyn really is? From what I saw in court, Caitlyn was so measured she hardly seemed to need to look behind her or to the side when entering the court to acknowledge her own family supporting her during a hearing. She was always destined to lose. One has a sense she really wanted to feel their faith and love and trust in her, wanted to see and acknowledge that support, but wouldn't let herself show any emotions. But I think we saw the difference between the Caitlyn in court and the real Caitlyn through her sister, who often sobbed audibly in court. Do you see, this crime wasn't committed by a meek, passive, emotionally disciplined person, but the opposite. It's for this reason, this super strict attempt to seem cool and calm in the courtroom, that there's not a single photo from the press pool showing the front of Caitlyn's face. That is also a rarity in trial coverage. Even so, that narrative, the emotional narrative, has been neatly excised out of almost the whole trial narrative. Colin Strickland didn't want to talk about it. The defense denied the notion that someone might become jealous in an on-again, off-again relationship. Even the prosecution didn't really go there, and to be fair, they didn't have to. The prosecution basically won this by making it a scientific case. They had a mountain of evidence over and above the motive in this case, one which was never in any doubt to begin with, except that Strickland and Armstrong were hoping to pull the wool over people's eyes in the hope that it would all just go away. Much as my heart goes out to the Wilson family, you heard the father speaking at the beginning of this clip, Eric Wilson. I don't know whether they've been completely honest about what was going on in Mo's heart either. You may not like to hear that, but on one issue there is no doubt. In this case, the emotional narrative was lost. Not even Mo's best friend, Amity Rockwell, who also dated Strickland, pitched up as a witness to tell that story. So how do we find our way back to it? If this is the reason Mo was murdered and no one wants to talk about it in a murder trial, how do we uncover the all-important emotional narrative? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Thank you to the dozens of you who have subscribed. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Oh, by the way, there will be just some information about a live I'll be doing, my first live in America, and probably in the last 5 weeks. So I'll talk to you guys about that at the end of this episode. So anyway, let's get started. Normally I don't like sentencing hearings, although it's an opportunity for friends and family to contribute real depth. It's a chance to really tell us about who someone is. It's an opportunity to get to know the identities beyond the superficial, to speak to who someone really was. But instead it tends to be kind of warm and fuzzy, touchy-feely, full of cliches and overloaded with emotion. All of that's understandable. I'm simply saying it doesn't really have any substance in terms of the actual narrative. One way to at least acknowledge the raw reality of what was done to Mo is by, and once you acknowledge that raw reality, that's also when some of this emotional narrative kind of starts leaking through. One way to do that is by looking to Caitlyn Cash and listening to what she has to say. And it really does tug at the heartstrings. You may have heard this before. I'm going to read it again. It's Caitlyn Cash's testimony in court, basically her just giving a short description of her experience coming up on Mo in her apartment. These are her words. Caitlyn, I want you to know that I fought for Mo with everything I had that night. From the moment that I got home and started doing chest compressions, which was the longest 10 minutes of my life, I remember feeling so relieved when the police arrived that help was finally there. I fought for her afterwards when I was pulled from my home by police and taken downstairs. I initially refused to go to the police because I didn't want to leave her alone. I couldn't understand why they wouldn't bring her downstairs to the ambulance so they could take her to the hospital. That was the first moment that night that I realized that there was no coming back from this. I was questioned for almost 3 hours that night. They finally let me wash the blood off my hands in the police station bathroom. I'll never forget that moment in the police station bathroom, washing the blood turn red and wanting to put it back on my hands because that's all that was left of her. Caitlyn attended trial from start to finish, as far as I could see, and one has the impression if any person in this case fought for justice for Mo, wanted to be a voice for Mo, knew what had happened to Mo and wouldn't let it go, even felt guilty about what she wasn't able to do to save her, it was Caitlyn Cash. She's the only real hero of the story. I'm not going to deal with the emotional narrative here in the depth it deserves, except to touch on a few details in the state's and defense's arguments that are relevant to the emotional narrative. The above slide is an excellent summary of the entire trial narrative via 5 salient observations. The fifth and final link in that chain is almost certainly, is the easiest to miss. Mo wasn't just shot twice in the head. One or either of those shots would have been fatal. The third shot in the heart shows just how personal the motive was in this case, and that is what the state said. Shot in the heart equals personal. But personal is the wrong word. It was personal only because it was so emotional. The shot through the heart was, in a sense, revenge for Caitlyn herself, feeling shot through the heart. Rick Kofer, Caitlyn's defense attorney, always seemed to know in order to win his case, he needed some kind of mindfuckery that would make the emotional narrative go away. At one point in his closing argument, Kofer said,
"The truth of the matter is that Caitlyn's emotions and her actions were normal."
Well, the jury didn't think so, and I don't think her visiting Mo Wilson's Strava page 6 times on the day she was murdered is normal either. Did you know when Armstrong was originally interviewed by Austin PD, when she was asked if she was aware what had happened on Maple Road the night before, she wouldn't use Mo Wilson's name and seemed to be suggesting she didn't know her name. She referred instead to Mo as, quote, one of the women in the cycling community, end quote. Why is there this emotional distance in her phraseology? Well, because Caitlyn herself knew her weakness and the weakness of her case. If she created an impression she didn't know who Mo was, that there was some kind of disconnection between knowing her, well, then the emotions are minimized. Certainly the impression of the emotions are minimized. Detective Katie Connor testified that she thought Armstrong knew Wilson's name, even though she didn't say it. She also said she became more suspicious of Armstrong after her interview on May 12th because Caitlyn mentioned not knowing that Strickland was seeing Wilson. Well, Connor said she later found out through phone data that Armstrong did know of Wilson at that time. Why did Armstrong deliberately lie about this? Well, to cover over the all-revealing emotional narrative. Does that make sense? Covering up in true crime isn't just deleting phone data, washing clothes, or hiding the murder weapon. It's also covering over the real story with words and stories that aren't completely true. And when we're talking about that, it's really covering up the emotional narrative, the narrative that's going to give everything away. And I also don't think her lawyers or even Caitlyn herself really believed her emotions were normal, given the extremely emotionally reserved performance we saw during this trial. And it is a performance. I've sat in on around half a dozen murder trials, meaning in court, and I'd say this is by far the most emotionless, deadpan defendant I've ever seen on trial. That's no accident. That's by design. It was meant to manipulate the jury into thinking that some other jealous person committed this crime. Colin Strickland. Caitlyn, I think, should have testified in court. She was always going to lose this case, but she could have won over some sympathy by testifying. Well, why didn't she? I suspect because she didn't trust her own emotions while on the stand. I want to conclude this analysis by highlighting a point many seem to miss. Did you know that Caitlyn's Jeep left the scene of the crime just 2 minutes after the murder? Think about it. The vehicle is circling the block around Maple Avenue for around an hour. It's in that area for around an hour. Some of that time is parking for about half an hour. But then suddenly, 2 minutes after the shots are recorded, suddenly the car leaves the area. Why? Because it's job done. I'm not going to take it further than that, except to say I made a mistake when I left the trial on Thursday after the closing arguments, although I suspected a quick verdict, something like after 2 hours or so of deliberating. As far as I know, the Texas jury deliberated for 2.5 hours. I have seen the media in some places say 3.5 hours. I didn't know the sentencing phase would immediately follow the verdict. I traveled a long way to get to the trial, so it's too bad I didn't know they do things differently in Texas. You may remember the Laurie Vallow verdict occurred on May 31st, while sentencing only happened more than 2 months later on I think it was May 23rd, and then sentencing was on July 31st. But that's how you learn, and I am learning, slowly but surely, the fabric surrounding these cases and also some of the legal technicalities. I'm in Colorado right now. It's very cold and snowing. I'll be leaving soon for the East Coast. I do have one more insight to share in this particular case, which I hope to do soon, over the next couple of days, hopefully tomorrow or the day after. It's important to do it soon before that intimacy with the fabric starts wearing off. I also want to do a live. It'll probably be my only live in America and the first in more than about 5 weeks. That's a story in itself. And I'd just like to talk about my journey, some of the lessons learned, showing some of the footage I've collected and some really interesting insights, including quite a big one just yesterday in near Moffat and in the town of Crestone. And so I'll be sharing what's next for TCRS. It should be interesting and worthwhile, so look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.